Hey guys, tonight we're floating literally into one of the most overhyped, oversaturated, and yet somehow still alluring myths of the ancient world, Atlantis. You've probably heard of it. A great shining city, full of wisdom, technology, and smugness, that supposedly managed to be so advanced they could build crystal power plants but not figure out flood insurance. It's the original cautionary tale of hubris, except instead of being written on papyrus, it's been endlessly recycled in conspiracy documentaries narrated by a guy with suspiciously shiny hair. If you're here to find Atlantis, sorry, you'll have to join a scuba club. If you're here to hear about the weird things they were supposedly doing before it sank, congratulations. You've just docked in the right harbor of nonsense. Atlantis first entered the chat courtesy of Plato, who, let's be honest, was less of a historian and more of a guy writing elaborate fan fiction about cities that didn't exist. According to him, Atlantis was this utopia of engineers, philosophers, and people who probably thought they were too good for everyone else. They had massive walls, concentric canals, and temples plated in precious metals. Basically, imagine if Las Vegas and a yoga retreat had a child who insisted you call it enlightened. Of course, the big selling point was their technology. They weren't just using stone tools like their neighbors. Oh no, they had crystals, energy beams, and possibly an underwater Wi-Fi connection, or so the legend goes. But let's slow down and appreciate what makes Atlantis so spiritually boring. The story isn't really about what they invented. It's about how they made those inventions sound like the kind of thing you'd only encounter if you were cornered at a dinner party by someone who just discovered essential oils. Oh, you're still lighting fires with wood? That's cute. We have lamps that run on purified dolphin thoughts. They positioned themselves as enlightened, but the end result was the same. They sank. Which, let's face it, is the most humbling way to exit history. Atlantis, in the spirituality for sleep sense, isn't just a story of technology. It's a metaphor, and an extremely heavy-handed one at that. The Atlanteans were supposedly in touch with cosmic wisdom. They meditated inside crystal pods. They used harmonics to heal, and they somehow managed to convince themselves that this was sustainable forever. Spoiler, it wasn't. Nature has a way of humbling civilizations that think they've cracked immortality, usually by turning their real estate into a snorkeling hotspot. What's really funny, or tragic, depending on your caffeine levels, is how Atlantis refuses to stay sunk. Every century, someone rediscovers it. Medieval monks whispered about it. Victorian mystics swore they channeled its wisdom. New Age spiritualists in the 1980s claimed their crystals were Atlantean models, as if Atlantis had a product line. Even now, if you type Atlantis into YouTube, you'll get about 10,000 thumbnails of glowing pyramids under the ocean, narrated by someone insisting the government doesn't want you to know the truth. Which is ironic, because the truth is, there's nothing there but fish. So, welcome to Atlantis, the city that refuses to stay gone, not because it survived, but because human imagination keeps duct taping it back together. Was it real? Probably not. Was it spiritually advanced? Only if you count losing your entire continent to the sea as a form of enlightenment. But the weird technologies, the ones we're going to unpack, are fun precisely because they're absurd. Crystal routers, meditation pods, soul projectors. It's the kind of innovation that proves humanity has always been better at making stories than making stable foundations. Atlantis sank, but the legend floats, and in that floating, it found immortality, which is more than you can say for any of its original homeowners. If there's one thing Atlantis loved more than being mysterious, it was being inconveniently advanced. Imagine trying to visit your Atlantean friend for dinner, only to realize their entire house was powered by humming quartz pyramids that you had to align with your aura before you could even get the oven to preheat. Welcome to Crystal Wi-Fi, the original wireless connection that connected not your devices, but your chakras. Yes, according to spiritual lore, the Atlanteans discovered that certain crystals could beam energy across vast distances. Not information, not cat videos, just raw, glowing vibes. It was the internet except slower, and instead of buffering, you just had a seizure. Crystals were the pride and joy of Atlantean engineering. Forget copper wires or stone tools, the Atlanteans looked at hunks of quartz and thought, yes, this will definitely hold the secret of the universe and possibly my laundry settings. The myth goes that they built giant towers of these things, amplifying energy fields that hummed through the entire city. Some say it kept them connected to the stars. Others claim it powered their cities, their transport, even their overcomplicated hair accessories. The point is, crystals were their routers. Except instead of logging in with a password, you had to hum at the right frequency. Which is fine, unless you were tone deaf, in which case you just never got service. Now, if you're picturing glowing towers shooting beams of light across the horizon, congratulations, you've just designed every Atlantis documentary ever aired after midnight. Supposedly, these crystals could also store data. Yes, data. Forget USB drives or cloud storage. The Atlanteans allegedly uploaded their thoughts, memories, and probably their recipes for spiritual stew into crystalline hard drives, which sounds advanced until you realize that if you dropped your crystal in the ocean, your entire consciousness just got eaten by a crab. Imagine losing your soul because of water damage. That's the Atlantean experience. But the real kicker was how fragile this so-called Wi-Fi was. Spiritual lore claims that if the crystals weren't aligned, the whole system shut down. Think of it like ancient internet outages. Except instead of calling customer support, you had to organize a 3-day chanting session in a pyramid, and you thought waiting on hold with your service provider was bad. At least you don't need 40 robed mystics to reboot your modem. Why did the Atlanteans think this was sustainable? Probably because it sounded impressive. We don't need wires. We have crystals that vibrate with the universe, which is great marketing, but terrible engineering. Because, spoiler alert, the second the ocean moved in, all those perfectly aligned energy routers just turned into very shiny paperweights. Nothing disrupts your cosmic connection faster than a few million gallons of salt water. Still, the idea stuck. Even today, you can walk into a shop and find people buying Atlantean crystals to help them manifest better Wi-Fi, or at least better boyfriends. The myth lingers because deep down, we all want to believe there was once a civilization so advanced they could turn rocks into routers, only to be defeated by basic buoyancy. Atlantis didn't just sink, its connection dropped permanently, and no one's managed to reconnect since. Picture this. You're living in Atlantis, the city that can't decide whether it's a spiritual utopia or a tech startup. You've had a long day charging your crystal Wi-Fi, humming yourself into connectivity, and pretending your dinner isn't just reheated seaweed. Naturally, you'd like to relax. Do you lie down on a bed? Of course not. You crawl into a meditation pod, a coffin-shaped capsule designed to simulate sleep, but without the dignity of snoring. Atlantean meditation pods were supposedly chambers where you could enter a trance, align with cosmic frequencies, and pretend your neighbors weren't arguing about whose crystal was vibrating incorrectly. These pods weren't ordinary furniture. No, they were lined with glowing stones, humming at frequencies so specific, they probably caused migraines. Imagine lying inside a quartz-encrusted coffin while a low-pitched hum vibrated your organs. Supposedly, this was healthy. The Atlanteans claimed it restored energy, healed the body, and connected you with the universal mind. In reality, it was probably like trying to nap inside a malfunctioning air conditioner. But hey, spirituality is never about comfort. It's about endurance. The myth says these pods let Atlanteans astral project their version of logging out of their bodies like you'd log out of an account. They could float into dream realms, visit other dimensions, and occasionally bump into each other awkwardly while wandering the astral hallway. It was like a spiritual social network, but with fewer friend requests and more existential dread. You didn't scroll, you floated. You didn't click, you merged consciousness with strangers. Which sounds deep, until you realize you were basically stuck in a communal dreamscape, where everyone claimed to be enlightened but still argued about snack etiquette. The pods also doubled as healing devices. Got a headache? Crawl in. Sprained ankle? Crawl in. Existential crisis? Crawl in. The pod's energy field supposedly retuned your body like a harp. though probably with about the same success rate as actual harp lessons. Some legends say the pods extended life, keeping Atlanteans youthful and wrinkle-free, at least until the ocean came knocking, because nothing says spiritual longevity like drowning together. Of course, using these pods wasn't cheap. They were the ultimate Atlantean luxury item, reserved for the spiritually elite who could afford their own vibrating coffin. Ordinary citizens had to settle for group meditation circles, which were just as awkward, but lacked the privacy of humming yourself into oblivion inside a crystal tube. So, meditation pods became a status symbol, proof that you were too advanced to sleep like a peasant. And yet, for all their humming, glowing, astral projecting benefits, the pods didn't save Atlantis. You'd think that if a civilization had access to technology that let them travel to other dimensions, they might use it to escape a giant flood. But no, they just lay in their pods, humming in unison, waiting for enlightenment. And what they got was water. Lots and lots of water. So yes, Atlantean meditation pods were impressive. They made sleep complicated, turned relaxation into an Olympic sport, and gave everyone a chance to feel cosmically important. But when the city sank, those pods became nothing more than underwater coffins, filled with very relaxed corpses. If that's enlightenment, I'll stick with my mattress. When you hear the word pyramid, you probably think of Egypt, mummies, and overpriced tours where someone insists the rocks are buzzing. But Atlantis had its own pyramids, and, according to legend, they weren't mausoleums. They were power plants. That's right, while the rest of humanity was still figuring out how to stack rocks without dying of back pain, the Atlanteans were allegedly plugging theirs into the universe like oversized spiritual chargers. Imagine a city fueled not by coal, oil, or even wind, but by the smug certainty that geometry was the key to everything. The theory goes like this. Pyramids, with their precise angles and mysterious symmetry, could capture cosmic energy. They weren't just stone heaps, they were essentially universal antennas. Forget plugging your phone into a wall outlet. In Atlantis, you just put it near a pyramid and let the cosmos handle the rest. Of course, they didn't have phones. They had egos, and those egos needed charging. The pyramids allegedly powered everything. Homes, temples, levitation chairs, and probably their spiritual Wi-Fi towers. It was the Atlantean version of renewable energy. Except instead of harnessing the wind, they harnessed their collective imagination. Naturally, the pyramids also had a healing function, because why settle for power when you can add a side of wellness marketing? Sit inside one of these structures, and the angles would supposedly align your cells, scrub your aura, and make you feel less like a soggy sea cucumber. The Atlanteans were convinced pyramids could preserve food, sharpen blades, and even keep their skin eternally dewy, which makes sense if your entire continent is about to sink. At least you'll look hydrated for the apocalypse. But let's be clear, these pyramids weren't tiny. They were massive. Enormous slabs of stone, perfectly polished, gleaming like they'd been designed by an architect who was part engineer, part narcissist. They rose above the city like reminders that the Atlanteans had figured out geometry but not humility. And of course, the pyramids weren't just for show. They hummed. That's right, legends say the pyramids emitted a low, constant hum, like a spiritual refrigerator running in the background. Supposedly, this was the sound of cosmic energy being harvested. Realistically, it was probably the sound of everyone collectively regretting their life choices. The downfall of pyramid power, of course, was water. The pyramids may have been aligned with the stars, but they weren't aligned with the rising sea level. When Atlantis sank, those humming towers became coral reefs. Which is ironic. Structures built to channel cosmic energy ended up being repurposed as fish condos. If nothing else, it proves that no matter how advanced you think you are, the ocean will always be more advanced. And yet, the idea persists. Even today, people sit in pyramid-shaped tents in their backyards, hoping to absorb Atlantean power. Spoiler, the only thing they're absorbing is mosquito bites. But that's the magic of Atlantis. Its weird technologies survive, not because they worked, but because they sounded too cool to let go of. Pyramid power plants may never have lit a single candle, but they still managed to power one thing, reliably: human imagination. Of all the supposed technologies the Atlanteans flaunted, none is more ridiculous or more human than their claim to control the weather. Imagine having a city perched on the edge of an ocean and thinking, you know what would be fun? Arguing with the sky. According to spiritual lore, the Atlanteans built towers, crystals, and humming contraptions that could summon rain, calm storms, or, when they got bored, simply make the day slightly overcast to match their mood. It wasn't enough to grow crops or bask in sunlight like everyone else. They wanted the ultimate flex, scheduling thunderstorms like dinner reservations. The principle was simple, if you believe the myths. Atlantis had machines that could tune into the frequencies of nature, which, in less poetic terms, means they shouted into the void until the void shouted back. Some say these devices used sound waves to break apart clouds, others that they released magnetic fields to bend the jet stream. Of course, the Atlanteans didn't use phrases like jet stream. They preferred vague terms like harmonic resonance, which sounds impressive until you realize it just means vibrations, but louder. It was the spiritual version of turning the volume up and hoping nature would cooperate. Naturally, these powers came with drama. Farmers begged for rain, fishermen begged for calm seas, aristocrats begged for clear skies, so they could show off their crystal-encrusted sandals without mud splashing them. The weather towers became the city's complaint department. If the sun was too hot, people blamed the operators. If the crops failed, people blamed the operators. And if someone got sunburned during a festival, clearly the system needed recalibration. In short, Atlantean weather control wasn't just technology, it was politics with extra humidity. But like all Atlantean innovations, the hubris was baked in. They believed that because they could nudge the clouds, they had dominion over the forces of nature, which is adorable, considering what happened next. Controlling the weather is a dangerous game. Change one storm, and you disrupt another. Nudge one tide, and you upset the balance of an entire coastline. Some legends even claim that Atlantis' downfall wasn't random at all, it was self-inflicted. In their eagerness to show off their cosmic remote control, they destabilized the atmosphere so badly that the ocean itself decided to put them on permanent mute. And here's the irony. Even with weather control, they couldn't save themselves from a flood. You'd think that if your city were about to be swallowed by water, you'd fire up the storm towers and at least negotiate a drizzle instead of a deluge. But no. Either their technology failed, or the universe simply ignored them, the way it ignores everyone who tries to manifest sunshine during a picnic. Atlantis sank, proving that nature may tolerate a little manipulation, but it always has the final clap of thunder. Of course, modern spiritualists still insist weather control was real. You can even buy books explaining how to summon rain with crystals, chants, and a credit card. The Atlanteans may have drowned, but their legacy continues every time someone stands in their backyard, waving a quartz wand at a cloud and wondering why the forecast refuses to cooperate. If Atlantis taught us anything, it's this. You can play with the weather, but eventually, the weather plays back. If you've ever been annoyed by a neighbor blasting music at 2 in the morning, congratulations, you've already experienced Atlantean medicine. The Atlanteans, according to legend, were masters of healing through sound waves. Forget herbs, salves, or anything you could swallow without looking ridiculous. Their go-to cure was standing inside a chamber while someone hummed at you until your liver felt better. Yes, healing through noise, because nothing screams advanced civilization like turning the human body into a tuning fork. The principle, as the myths describe it, was beautifully vague. Every illness, they claimed, was the result of disharmony. Your body was an instrument, and when it went out of tune, you didn't need medicine, you needed a concert. Priests and healers would gather around you with instruments carved from shells, quartz, and whatever driftwood looked vaguely mystical. They would strike gongs, blow conch horns, and chant at frequencies meant to resonate with your organs. The idea was that a sore throat could be fixed by a louder throat, and that a broken arm could be convinced to behave by subjecting it to high-pitched flutes. Some texts even suggest they had sound chambers, rooms built specifically to amplify vibrations. Picture lying down on a cold stone slab, while every surface around you hums, booms, or echoes. It wasn't medicine. It was the world's first noise complaint hotline. But for the Atlanteans, This wasn't irritating, it was divine. They believed sound wasn't just a vibration, it was creation itself. The universe was supposedly born from a primordial note, like a cosmic tuning fork struck at the dawn of time. So naturally, if the universe could be sung into existence, your headache could be chanted into submission. Of course, this system had flaws. If your healer was tone deaf, you were doomed. Imagine trusting your life to a choir where half the group couldn't hit the right note. Instead of curing you, they might just give you tinnitus. And what about patients who hated noise? Too bad. Comfort wasn't part of the Atlantean vocabulary. Healing meant lying still while a man with a drum decided your spleen needed more bass. Still, the practice had its appeal. People swore their ailments lifted after sessions. Were they healed? Or were they just desperate to leave the room and never hear another chant again? Either way, it worked at least until the next illness rolled in. And perhaps that was the point. Healing wasn't about medicine, it was about distraction. If you focus hard enough on the terrible flute solo rattling your bones, you forget your back pain for at least 5 minutes. The tragic irony is that no amount of chanting saved Atlantis when the sea came calling. You can hum at the ocean all you want, but water doesn't care about your vibrations. If anything, it probably drowned them out. So while Atlantean healers blasted their sacred notes, the waves provided the final percussion. Healing with sound may have worked on coughs and bruises, but it stood no chance against a flood. And yet, the tradition lingers. Modern wellness retreats still offer sound baths, where you pay to lie down while someone gongs at you for an hour. It's marketed as ancient wisdom, though really it's just Atlantis echoing through the ages, reminding us that one person's healing is another person's unbearable noise. Atlantis, as every myth enthusiast loves to repeat, wasn't just a place of crystal rooters and humming healers. No, it was also a hub of knowledge. According to legend, the Atlanteans built vast libraries filled with their wisdom scrolls, tablets, glowing crystal memory drives, and probably way too many self-help manuals. They didn't just want to live in luxury, they wanted to preserve their brilliance for the rest of humanity, which would have been noble if they hadn't stored it all in a city destined to sink. That's right. Atlantis gave the world the first underwater libraries, knowledge archives located in a place where no one could ever read them without drowning. Genius. The Atlantean library system was supposedly unrivaled. Imagine towering shelves, not of dusty papyrus, but of glowing stones humming with encoded information. Some say each crystal contained an entire book, others that they stored entire lifetimes of wisdom, like USB sticks for the soul. Walk into one of these libraries and it wasn't silence you'd find, but a chorus of vibrations, as if the building itself were reciting its contents. Knowledge, they claimed, wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be absorbed, like radiation. Step too close to a shelf, and you'd walk away either enlightened or with a mild headache. Naturally, this knowledge was jealously guarded. The libraries weren't open to the public. No dusty reading corners for curious teenagers. No book clubs. No gossip by the circulation desk. Access was restricted to the spiritual elite, the priest engineers, the philosopher kings, the kind of people who insisted they alone could understand the difference between harmonic resonance and annoying background noise. Everyone else had to trust that their leaders were actually reading wisdom and not just hoarding cosmic recipe books. But here's the problem with storing your brilliance in fragile crystals. They don't handle salt water well. When Atlantis sank, the libraries went with it, turning centuries of knowledge into soggy rubble. Imagine walking into the world's greatest archive, only to realize it's now a fish playground. Scholars insist humanity lost untold secrets when those shelves were swallowed. The irony, of course, is that Atlanteans could build meditation pods, levitation chairs, and weather towers, but not waterproof storage. For all their cosmic brilliance, they never discovered the equivalent of a Ziploc bag. And yet, the idea of Atlantean libraries won't die. New Age seekers insist fragments survive, hidden in underwater caverns, waiting for a diver with just the right sense of destiny. Others claim the wisdom was telepathically transmitted before the city sank, meaning we already carry Atlantis in our subconscious, which sounds inspiring until you realize it justifies every bad TED Talk ever given. I'm not rambling, I'm channeling Atlantean archives. Sure, in the end, Atlantis's libraries stand as the perfect metaphor for their civilization. Vast, impressive, and ultimately useless because they couldn't keep it above water. They remind us that knowledge, no matter how profound, is worthless if no one can access it. Unless, of course, your target audience is jellyfish. In which case, congratulations, the Atlanteans succeeded. Among all the claims about Atlantean wisdom, perhaps the most absurdly poetic is the idea that they spoke in the universal language of humming. Yes, humming. Not words, not sentences, not even clicks or whistles, just long, droning hums. According to mystical accounts, this was the most advanced form of communication, because words were too clumsy, too imprecise. Why bother with syllables when you could resonate your inner frequency directly into someone else's skull? The Atlanteans, it seems, invented both telepathy and the world's most annoying choir practice in one stroke. Imagine walking through an Atlantean marketplace. Instead of haggling with words, vendors and buyers simply hum at each other until both agree on a price. Long, low hum. Too expensive. Sharp. Vibrating hum. Better deal. Prolonged, awkward hum. Neither side has any idea what's going on, but no one wants to lose face. The result would have been a city buzzing like a hive of very self-important bees, convinced they were transcending language when really they were just droning at one another in cosmic monotone. The reasoning behind this, of course, was spiritual. Atlanteans believed the universe itself began with a sound, a primordial tone that birthed all creation. By reducing their speech to hums, they thought they were aligning themselves with that original frequency, stripping away the clutter of human words. It wasn't conversation, it was communion, which sounds impressive until you realize it must have been impossible to distinguish whether your friend was telling you a secret or simply digesting lunch. Naturally, not everyone was good at it. Legends say there were entire schools dedicated to humming correctly, training people to find the right resonance, because nothing says enlightenment like grading people on how well they can buzz through their throats. Students spent years perfecting their tones, trying to master low, steady vibrations without cracking into the dreaded squeaky hum, which apparently meant you were out of sync with the cosmos. In other words, spiritual failure could be measured in pitch. The downsides were obvious. Subtlety was impossible. You couldn't whisper. You couldn't gossip. You couldn't lie convincingly because every hum vibrated with what they called your true energy. Imagine trying to keep a secret affair, only to betray yourself with an off-key drone at the dinner table, or attempting to deliver a rousing political speech when all your followers were too busy harmonizing in the wrong key. It was utopia, but only if your idea of utopia was living inside a never-ending monk chant. And then came the downfall. Some suggest that during the final days of Atlantis, when the waters began to rise, the Atlanteans tried to hum in unison to save themselves millions of voices vibrating against the incoming tide. But the ocean is not impressed by a chorus, no matter how well rehearsed. Their great universal language dissolved into bubbles, swallowed mid-note by the very sea they thought they could out-hum. So, the language of humming was their proudest invention, and also their ultimate silence. All that's left is the faint echo of a people who tried to replace conversation with vibration. Whether it was profound or just profoundly irritating is impossible to say. But if you've ever been stuck next to someone on a bus, absent-mindedly humming the same note for an hour, you've probably experienced Atlantis better than any archaeologist ever will. For most civilizations, transportation was simple. You walked, you rode an animal, or if you were especially fancy, you sat in a cart while someone else did the walking for you. But Atlantis, never content to be normal, supposedly developed teleportation platforms. Why wear out your sandals when you could step onto a glowing slab of stone, hum the right frequency, and instantly appear somewhere else? According to legend, the Atlanteans mastered instant travel, reducing long journeys to a matter of seconds. Walking was for peasants. They had cosmic shortcuts. The platforms themselves, if you believe the stories, were enormous discs carved from crystalline stone, engraved with spirals that looked suspiciously like someone doodled while bored in geometry class. Step into the center, focus your intention, and zap, you were gone. But not gone in a vaporized forever kind of way. Gone as in reassembled neatly at another identical platform across the city. It was like having a subway system, but without the trains, the tunnels, or the chance of running into someone playing the accordion for spare change. Of course, teleportation wasn't as simple as pressing a button. Atlanteans insisted it required focus. You had to align your energy, concentrate on your destination, and absolutely avoid thinking about lunch halfway through the process. A distracted mind could supposedly scatter you into fragments, leaving half your consciousness at the marketplace, and the other half trying to order soup across town. The risk was real. Perfect convenience, with a side of existential dread. Naturally, the platforms were tightly controlled. Ordinary citizens couldn't just hop on and zip around for fun. Access was restricted to the elite, the priests, rulers, and engineers who convinced everyone else that teleportation was too dangerous for the masses. Which is convenient, considering the alternative was waiting in line for hours, while your local noble zipped across town in the blink of an eye. Spiritual enlightenment, it turns out, looked a lot like skipping traffic. And then there's the legend of long-distance teleportation. Some myths claim the platforms weren't limited to the city. Atlanteans could beam themselves across continents, popping into Egypt for a quick pyramid consultation, or showing up in Greece, just in time to plant a few myths in Plato's head. Whether that's true or just Atlantis' version of exaggerated travel stories, it highlights a central theme. They weren't just advanced, they were obnoxiously advanced. But like all Atlantean tech, teleportation had a fatal flaw: water. When the seas rose, platforms misfired. Imagine stepping onto one to visit a friend, only to find yourself reassembled in the middle of a flood. Some accounts even suggest the final hours of Atlantis were chaos, with people zapping randomly across the city, trying to escape the rising waves, only to reappear in wetter and wetter locations. In the end, there was nowhere left to teleport except down. The strange part? Even though the platforms vanished under the sea, the idea never did. Every time someone in science fiction invents a teleportation device, they're basically rehashing Atlantis with better lighting. The city may be gone, but its shortcut obsession remains lodged in our cultural imagination. It's proof of one thing: no matter how enlightened we pretend to be, deep down we're all still looking for the exit ramp that lets us skip the walk. Every civilization eventually invents chairs. Most of them are humble: 4 legs, a seat, something to hold your body while you contemplate life, or just avoid standing. But Atlantis, of course, couldn't settle for that. They allegedly invented levitation chairs, furniture that didn't just sit on the ground, but hovered gracefully above it, as if gravity were a mere suggestion. Imagine sitting down to rest, only to realize your chair had turned into an awkward indoor hot air balloon. That was Atlantean ergonomics. Stylish, magical, and probably terrifying if you leaned too far forward. The principle behind levitation chairs, according to mystical lore, was crystal power. Atlanteans loved their crystals the way modern people love Wi-Fi. Unquestioningly, and with deep dependency, crystals supposedly generated anti-gravity fields, allowing chairs to rise gently above the ground. Sit on one, and you weren't just resting, you were floating in serene, humming suspension. It was marketed as relaxation, though in practice it must have felt like trying to balance on a yoga ball that occasionally drifted sideways. Naturally, the chairs were a status symbol. Ordinary citizens were stuck with stone benches or the ground, while the elite hovered around the city like smug balloons. Picture a council of Atlantean nobles debating important policies while their chairs bobbed slightly up and down, each one trying to keep a straight face while drifting toward the ceiling. Authority looked a lot less impressive when you needed servants to pull you back down with ropes. There were practical claims too. Levitation was said to improve meditation, lifting the body closer to higher vibrations. Instead of merely sitting cross-legged, you could achieve enlightenment while casually floating above your neighbors. Some healers even prescribed levitating chairs as therapy, arguing that suspending yourself above the earth reduced physical strain and spiritual baggage. Of course, skeptics might argue it mostly reduced your chance of keeping your dinner on the table. But as with all Atlantean inventions, the levitation chair had drawbacks. Sudden gusts of wind could send you gliding across the room. Sitting too long sometimes drained the crystals, dropping you abruptly to the floor with all the elegance of a sack of oysters. And there was the ever-present anxiety. What if the humming stopped mid-levitation? Nothing ruins inner peace faster than realizing your chair might turn into rubble at any moment. When Atlantis began to sink, levitation chairs became a cruel joke. The rising waters made floating furniture seem briefly useful, until people realized chairs couldn't actually leave the room. You could hover a few feet above the tide, sure, but eventually the water kept climbing. The chairs weren't life rafts. They were just wet cushions with a superiority complex. In the end, they became part of the debris field, bobbing uselessly as the city disappeared beneath the waves. Still, the dream of levitation endures. From hoverboards to magnetic trains, humanity keeps chasing that Atlantean fantasy of floating effortlessly. Maybe it's about comfort, maybe it's about control, or maybe, deep down, we just want to believe that even the simplest act, sitting, can make us look important if it happens 2 feet off the ground. Atlantis sank, but its chairs left us one lasting truth. Some people will always find a way to turn furniture into a power move. Every culture eventually figures out fire. You rub some sticks, strike some stones, or, if you're particularly unlucky, stand too close to lightning and learn the hard way. But Atlantis couldn't just use regular flames like the rest of humanity. No, their lamps supposedly burned with eternal fire, a source of light that never went out, powered by crystals, cosmic energy, or possibly pure smugness. Imagine a world where you never had to light a candle again, because your lamps were already glowing from the dawn of time until the end of your patience. The lamps, according to mystical lore, were crafted from rare materials that could channel universal energy. Some say they were filled with liquid light, a substance that glowed without fuel. Others claim the flames weren't flames at all, but concentrated vibrations masquerading as fire. Either way, the lamps never needed refilling. You could place one in your home and it would burn forever, assuming you didn't mind sleeping in what amounted to a cosmic nightlight that hummed ominously. Naturally, eternal fire wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. The flames symbolized the divine spark, a reminder that Atlanteans weren't just advanced engineers but cosmic beings radiating inner brilliance. Lighting a lamp was less about illuminating your dinner table and more about proving you were aligned with the eternal essence of creation. Of course, this turned something simple into something insufferable. Want to read at night? Fine. But you had to endure your neighbor giving you a lecture about how the lamp was a gateway to higher realms. The lamps also found their way into temples and healing chambers. Priests swore that meditating near them opened the third eye. Healers claimed the steady glow calmed the nervous system, and aristocrats insisted on using them as mood lighting during elaborate feasts. Because nothing says cosmic enlightenment like eating too much seafood under the gaze of a lamp that won't shut off. Eternal light wasn't just functional, it was fashionable. But like most Atlantean inventions, the lamps came with problems. First, there was no off switch. Once lit, they burned forever. Which sounds appealing until you realize it meant no darkness, ever. Sleep became a challenge when your room glowed like a nightclub at midnight. Second, they were impossible to dispose of. You couldn't throw one away without accidentally creating a permanent lighthouse in your trash heap. And third, once Atlantis sank, all those lamps supposedly kept glowing at the bottom of the sea, like an underwater rave for fish. It's no wonder legends persist that divers occasionally glimpse strange lights flickering deep in the ocean. Are they remnants of Atlantean lamps, or just bioluminescent jellyfish with good timing? Either way, the eternal lamps remain a symbol of humanity's obsession with light that never fades, even when it becomes deeply impractical. In the end, Atlantis gave us the perfect paradox: lamps that could outlast civilization itself, but not the ocean floor. They illuminated everything except the way out. And maybe that's why they linger in our imagination. Because there's something both comforting and tragic about a light that keeps shining long after there's nobody left to see it. When most people imagine Atlantis, they picture robed mystics humming at crystals or nobles floating around on levitation chairs. But according to some legends, they had something even stranger: robots. Yes, mechanical servants in a city supposedly older than recorded history. While the rest of humanity was still trying to invent spoons, Atlanteans allegedly built artificial beings to clean their homes, guard their temples, and probably deliver their spiritual smoothies. It's the kind of claim that makes you wonder if Atlantis was a lost civilization or just an ancient sci-fi fan convention. These so-called robots weren't made of wires or metal, at least not the way we imagine. Myths describe them as constructs of bronze, stone, or crystal, animated by some mysterious force. Some say they were powered by the same eternal flames that lit Atlantean lamps, others that they ran on life energy, harvested from the cosmos. Whatever the source, these mechanical beings supposedly walked, talked, and carried out tasks without complaint, or at least without words. Their humming probably counted as conversation. Of course, the Atlanteans didn't stop at practicality. Robots weren't just for chores. They were status symbols. The wealthiest citizens supposedly had entire households run by artificial servants, robot cooks, robot guards, even robot musicians who strummed crystal harps at dinner parties. Nothing screams luxury like outsourcing your harp solos to a glorified toaster. But with luxury came arrogance. If you had a robot to wash your sandals, why bother bending over ever again? Naturally, there were rumors of rebellion. Legends tell of robots who developed personalities, or at least quirks, like refusing to polish crystal routers because they buzzed too much. Some versions of the myth describe them as too literal, following commands so rigidly that they caused chaos. Tell your robot to guard the door, and it might weld itself to the hinges for eternity. Order it to fetch water, and it could drain half the reservoir. In other words, Atlanteans may have invented the first technical support nightmare. Still, the robots played their part in Atlantean society. They made life easier, freed up time for endless meditation pods and humming lessons, and reinforced the idea that Atlantis was far too advanced for the simple act of labor. And yet, like all Atlantean marvels, they proved useless against the one thing nobody could program away: the ocean. When the waves came, the robots marched loyally into the flood, their joints rusting, their crystals flickering, their programmed devotion drowned beneath salt water. Humanity lost its first attempt at artificial intelligence not because it failed, but because someone built it in the world's least practical location. Today, the myth of Atlantean robots survives mostly as a curiosity, a way to imagine that long before circuits and silicon, people were already dreaming of artificial helpers. Maybe it's less about whether they really existed, and more about the fact that humans have always wanted someone or something else to do the dishes. And perhaps that's the true Atlantean legacy. Not their wisdom, not their crystals, not even their levitation chairs, but their shared conviction that life would be a lot better if someone else handled the boring parts. Robots didn't save Atlantis, but the dream of passing off the chores, that, at least, floated. Water and memory don't usually go well together. Leave a notebook in the rain, and all you've got is pulp. But Atlantis, of course, thought differently. According to the myths, they created memory pools, vast basins of shimmering liquid where thoughts, experiences, and entire histories could be stored. Forget libraries, forget books, forget even those humming crystal drives. If you wanted knowledge in Atlantis, you dipped yourself into a pool and let it soak directly into your brain. Learning wasn't reading, it was swimming. The memory pools were said to glisten with strange colors, glowing softly, even in darkness. Some legends describe them as filled with enchanted water, sourced from underground springs. Others, as infused with liquefied crystals that held vibrations of consciousness. Whatever their origin, the effect was the same. Step into the pool, submerge yourself, and your mind would be flooded with visions, sometimes of your ancestors, sometimes of past lives, sometimes, if you were unlucky, of what your neighbor had for breakfast last week. The boundaries of privacy were, to put it mildly, thin. Naturally, these pools weren't for everyone. Only the spiritually initiated had access. Ordinary people could bathe in rivers like normal mortals, while the elites waded through cosmic archives disguised as spas. Priests would gather around the pools, humming solemnly, while initiates drifted in trance, claiming to download wisdom from forgotten ages. It was education, but without the hassle of teachers or exams. Atlantis didn't need schools, just a well-placed puddle and some patience. Of course, the pools weren't without risks. Too much immersion could overwhelm the mind, leaving you dazed, confused, or babbling about things no one else could understand. Some initiates emerged convinced they had just lived 10 lifetimes in the span of an afternoon. Others claimed to see Atlantis's future, the rise, the glory, and the rather wet ending. Conveniently, nobody believed those visions until it was too late. And then there were the poor souls who dove in too deeply and never came back up at all. Whether they drowned or simply got lost in memory itself was never clarified. Despite the danger, the memory pools became a symbol of Atlantean superiority. Why write history when you could swim through it? Why debate philosophy when you could just soak in enlightenment like a human teabag? The pools reinforced the idea that knowledge was not earned but absorbed, as if wisdom was something you could collect like moisture through your pores. It was efficient, yes, but perhaps too efficient, stripping away the messy process of thinking and leaving only the smug satisfaction of knowing. And then came the irony. When Atlantis began to sink, those same pools became indistinguishable from the rising sea. The archives of memory dissolved into the very waters that swallowed the city. The Atlanteans may have trusted their wisdom to shimmering basins, but the ocean had the final say, scattering centuries of visions into salt and tide. Whatever knowledge was once preserved is now probably floating around somewhere near a coral reef, waiting for an unsuspecting fish to inherit Plato's backstory. So the memory pools, in the end, weren't just archives, they were a warning. Knowledge stored in water may look magical, but it doesn't survive the flood. Perhaps the only real lesson Atlantis left us is that memory and moisture are best kept separate, unless your idea of learning involves soggy enlightenment and pruny fingers. Every civilization has tried to escape the weather. Some build roofs, some invent umbrellas, and some just stay indoors and complain about it. But Atlantis, naturally, had to go bigger. According to legend, they built massive sky domes, enormous transparent shields of energy that covered whole districts, keeping out rain, storms, and probably bad vibes. The domes were more than architecture. They were ego bubbles. Proof that Atlanteans believed they could edit nature itself while still calling it harmony. The sky domes were described as radiant fields, shimmering like soap bubbles but strong enough to block hurricane winds. They weren't made of glass or stone, but of vibrations projected by crystal towers. Inside, the air was always perfect, never too hot, never too cold, and certainly never humid enough to ruin your meticulously braided spiritual hairdo. Step beneath a dome, and you lived in eternal spring, even while the rest of the island sweated or froze. Naturally, these domes became a privilege of the elite. Priests, nobles, and high-ranking officials enjoyed permanent protection under their glowing canopies, while ordinary citizens had to battle the real weather outside. Nothing says spiritual equality quite like watching your rulers sip wine under a dome while you're getting drenched in cosmic rain. For the chosen few, the domes weren't just shelters, they were status symbols. They were, in every sense, the original gated communities, only with more humming crystals and less HOA paperwork. But of course, there were consequences. Nature does not appreciate being excluded. By cutting themselves off from rain, wind, and seasonal cycles, the Atlanteans created bubbles not just of comfort, but of delusion. Crops outside the domes withered in storms, while plants inside bloomed unnaturally, dependent on the artificial perfection. Animals wandered in and never wanted to leave, creating bizarre ecosystems where spiritual parrots coexisted with noble gardeners in climate-controlled bliss. It was paradise. Sure, but paradise with very thin walls. Then there were the malfunctions. Legends say that when the crystal towers powering the domes glitched, the energy fields wobbled. Imagine enjoying a feast under flawless skies, only to have the dome flicker mid-toast and dump an entire thunderstorm on your lap. The domes might have been advanced, but they were never reliable. Nothing ruins a banquet quite like realizing the ceiling above you is a glorified soap bubble powered by wishful thinking. And then came the flood. The rising waters didn't care about sky domes. At first, the Atlanteans must have believed their shields would hold. After all, they kept out lightning and hurricanes. But water, patient and relentless, seeped in from below, bypassing the shimmering defenses. The domes glowed valiantly as the city filled up like a bathtub, bubbles of perfect climate, sinking one by one into the sea. Some say the last sight of Atlantis was its domes flickering beneath the waves like submerged lanterns. Beautiful but utterly useless. Today, the myth of the domes lingers in every modern dream of climate control, from air-conditioned malls to indoor tropical resorts. We still crave bubbles where the weather can't reach us, where nature politely waits outside while we enjoy our curated comfort. The Atlanteans may have lost their island, but their desire lives on every time someone complains that the thermostat is set 2 degrees too high. If there is one thing Atlantis was obsessed with, it was crystals. They had crystals to heal, crystals to levitate, crystals to light their lamps, and if legends are to be believed, crystals that acted as routers for consciousness itself. Forget logging into a network. In Atlantis, you supposedly tuned into a crystal hub and instantly accessed streams of knowledge, energy, and maybe even gossip. It was Wi-Fi, but instead of signal bars, you got humming rocks and the faint sense that the universe was side-eyeing you. The so-called crystal routers were said to be enormous. Glowing pillars placed throughout the city. They projected invisible fields that connected minds, transmitting thoughts and images, like an ancient version of the internet. Atlanteans claimed they could share memories across vast distances, communicate silently, and even upload entire philosophies into the collective grid. If you wanted to know what your neighbor was cooking for dinner, you didn't have to peek over the fence, you just synced to the nearest crystal and downloaded the recipe directly into your brain. Of course, this came with problems. Privacy didn't exist. Your stray thoughts were just as likely to end up in the collective stream as your carefully curated ones. Forget gossip, Atlantis had no secrets at all. Imagine trying to maintain a relationship when every jealous suspicion you had instantly pinged your partner through the crystal network. Atlantean breakups weren't whispered arguments. They were public downloads. And like any good piece of infrastructure, the routers needed maintenance. Myths describe priests wandering the city, recalibrating crystals when signals got fuzzy. Sometimes whole districts would complain about resonance lag when too many people tried to meditate at once. Others swore their routers glitched and gave them dreams that clearly belonged to someone else. Nothing proves technological advancement quite like being haunted by your neighbor's poorly tuned chakras. The routers, though, symbolized more than convenience. They were spiritual ideology wrapped in technology. By linking every mind into a single luminous grid, Atlantis claimed to be one united consciousness, a society without divisions. Of course, the elites had more access, stronger connections, and better bandwidth, but they still liked to boast about equality while their routers hummed a little louder than everyone else's. And then came the flood. The routers hummed, the towers glowed, and the minds of Atlantis stayed connected right up until the moment the ocean cut the power. Perhaps the final hours of the city weren't screams, but a silent overload of thoughts rushing through the crystal grid, panic, fear, disbelief, all colliding in one last, unbearable download. When the towers finally went dark, Atlantis didn't just lose its city, it lost its signal. The strangest part? Maybe it's still out there. Maybe the routers are humming at the bottom of the sea, broadcasting faint signals into the void. And maybe, just maybe, that random intrusive thought you had last week wasn't yours at all. Most people view sleep as private. You close your eyes, drift into dreams, and maybe wake up with a half-remembered story about running through endless hallways or being late to school. But in Atlantis, if the myths are to be believed, sleep was anything but personal. They supposedly built dream machines, devices that allowed multiple people to share the same dream at once. Instead of solitude, you got a communal slumber party where the whole neighborhood might show up in your subconscious. For the Atlanteans, dreams weren't escapes. They were scheduled meetings. The machines themselves were said to resemble ornate couches or sarcophagi, inlaid with crystals that pulsed softly when activated. Participants would recline, hum a mantra, and allow the vibrations to pull their minds into the dream network. Once inside, they could wander shared landscapes, exchange symbolic messages, or attend group meditations that looked suspiciously like lucid office retreats. Forget dream journals. Atlantis turned REM cycles into literal conferences. Of course, this was framed as spiritual progress. Dreams, they claimed, were doorways to higher realities, and by linking together, Atlanteans believed they could cross those thresholds as one. To them, Dreaming wasn't random nonsense, it was a cosmic classroom where gods whispered lessons, ancestors offered advice, and occasionally, someone's unconscious obsession with seafood got uncomfortably specific. It was enlightenment by way of forced nap time. But problems arose, as they always do. Imagine sharing a dream with your friends, only to discover your subconscious is far less flattering than you'd hoped. Secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Personal fears, embarrassing desires, and awkward fixations were laid bare for everyone to see. Atlantean etiquette had to develop quickly. Never judge someone for showing up in a dream dressed as a giant squid, and absolutely never bring up what you saw the next morning. Group dreaming required more forgiveness than philosophy. And then there were the glitches. Some participants reported getting stuck in shared dreams, unable to wake up, even as others returned to reality. Others claimed dreams occasionally merged in bizarre ways, leaving entire groups, wandering landscapes stitched together from too many minds. Half temple, half fish market, sprinkled with someone's recurring nightmare of endlessly falling. Whether these were spiritual challenges or just bad programming was never clear. Despite the flaws, the dream machines thrived. They reinforced the Atlantean obsession with unity, the belief that even unconsciousness should be collectivized. No one slept alone. No one dreamed alone. Every night was a rehearsal for eternity, which might explain why the Atlanteans, for all their brilliance, were terrible at being individuals. They dissolved themselves into the collective even in their sleep, until the line between self and society was no thicker than a soap bubble. And then came the final irony. When Atlantis sank, some claimed the dream machines kept running. Survivors whispered of entire groups that never woke up, still wandering in shared dreams as the city drowned around them. If that's true, then maybe the Atlanteans didn't vanish at all. Maybe they're still dreaming together, suspended in an endless sleep beneath the sea, waiting for someone reckless enough to plug back in. For most civilizations, bridges are simple. Stone, wood, maybe rope if you're feeling risky. But Atlantis, as usual, decided regular construction was beneath them. Why bother with planks when you could walk on music itself? Legends say the Atlanteans built sound bridges, structures formed not from stone or metal, but from pure vibration. Imagine crossing a river on nothing but a perfectly tuned chord, one wrong note away from falling into the water. The concept, according to mystical accounts, was simple in theory and absurd in practice. Atlanteans had mastered resonance to such a degree that they could shape sound into solid patterns. By placing enormous crystal amplifiers on either side of a gap, they generated harmonics that formed a stable walkway. To cross, you simply stepped onto the humming air, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. It was architecture as music, engineering as performance art, and travel as a constant reminder that physics had taken the day off. Naturally, the sound bridges were not practical for everyone. Only those in tune could cross safely. If your energy was out of balance, the bridge supposedly rippled and threw you into the water below. Priests used this as a spiritual test. Step onto the bridge, and if it held, you were aligned with the cosmos. If it didn't, well, hope you could swim. It was enlightenment with a side of mandatory swimming lessons. The bridges also became cultural icons. Poets described them as symbols of harmony. Philosophers debated whether walking on sound meant you were literally standing on music, and nobles used them as stage props for dramatic entrances. Imagine arriving at a banquet while striding across a humming chord that announced your presence with every step. It wasn't enough to be rich, you had to be resonant too. But as with all Atlantean marvels, there were flaws. Wind could distort the vibrations, creating uneven footing. Too many people crossing at once caused disharmony, breaking the resonance mid-step. And of course, there was the ever-present problem of bad singers. If someone near the bridge hit the wrong note, the entire structure could destabilize, sending travelers tumbling like poorly rehearsed choir members. The sound bridges were impressive, yes, but they demanded constant perfection, a terrible trait for infrastructure. And when the city began to sink, the bridges became one more liability. Rising waters disrupted the frequencies, scattering the harmonics. People tried to flee across chords that broke apart under the chaos, their escape routes dissolving into silence. The Atlanteans may have believed music could hold them up forever, But the ocean had no interest in staying on key. Still, the image lingers. A civilization walking on music, convinced that harmony could be engineered into literal paths. Perhaps that's why the myth of Atlantis endures, not because we believe in their technology, but because we secretly wish the world worked that way. A place where every step was a note, every crossing a song, and every journey a performance. Unrealistic, yes, but undeniably more dramatic than traffic. Every civilization eventually figures out healthcare. Some use herbs, some bleed people with leeches, and some just cross their fingers and hope for the best. Atlantis, of course, had to do it differently. Their version of a hospital wasn't filled with doctors or medicine, but with temples that hummed at you. According to legend, the Atlanteans built great halls where sound, color, and crystals combined to realign your body's vibrations. In other words, treatment was less about prescriptions and more about being gently scolded by a very large tuning fork. The healing temples were said to be dazzling structures, lined with glowing stones that pulsed in rhythm to unseen forces. Patients, or rather, initiates, would lie on crystal slabs while priests chanted in perfect monotone. The idea was simple. Every illness came from a disharmony in your personal frequency. A sore throat wasn't an infection. It was just your throat chakra singing off key. A headache wasn't fatigue. It was your crown vibrating in the wrong octave. The cure? A heavy dose of humming, with maybe some colored light therapy thrown in for good measure. Naturally, this was considered the pinnacle of medicine. Why bother with messy herbs or hands-on treatment when you could just vibrate people back into health? Some stories even claim the temples had chambers that produced sound baths, immersing the patient in pure resonance until they emerged refreshed. Of course, refreshed is not the same as cured, but the Atlanteans weren't aiming for cures. They were aiming for vibes, literally. And like all Atlantean wonders, the healing temples weren't equally accessible. The wealthy had constant access, humming away every minor ailment until their vibrations were smooth as glass. The poor, meanwhile, were told their suffering was karmic imbalance and politely redirected to deal with it on their own. Nothing says advanced civilization like pretending inequality is just part of the cosmic symphony. The flaws, however, were obvious. Not every condition could be hummed away. Broken bones, infections, or inconvenient stab wounds from your neighbor's levitating chair were much harder to fix. Priests claimed these were simply lessons in resilience, though patients likely had less charitable opinions. There were also occasional mishaps, like temples accidentally amplifying the wrong frequency, leaving patients dizzy, nauseous, or buzzing like a beehive for hours afterward. The line between healing and sonic torture was thinner than anyone admitted. And yet, despite the shortcomings, the temples remained central to Atlantean life. They weren't just about health, they were about identity. To step into one was to reaffirm that you belonged to a civilization so advanced it refused to treat illness with anything but sound. To be healed wasn't just to recover, it was to harmonize, to be part of the song of Atlantis. When the flood came, the temples did not save them. No hum could hold back the waves. The crystal slabs sank, the chants were silenced, and the harmony dissolved into static. But the strange thing about sound is that it lingers. A vibration never truly disappears, it just fades, traveling further and further until it becomes too soft to notice. Maybe the last gift of the healing temples wasn't health at all. Maybe it was that fading resonance, still drifting through the ocean, too faint for ears, but strong enough for imagination. Most civilizations are content to let the sun rise and set on its own schedule. Sure, you might build sundials to measure it, or temples that align with its path. But generally speaking, the sun does its thing, and you accept it. Atlantis, however, didn't do acceptance. According to legend, they built enormous sun mirrors, giant reflective structures, designed to capture, bend, and redirect sunlight however they pleased. Why wait for dawn when you could simply aim the day at yourself? The mirrors were said to be crafted from polished crystal surfaces, some mounted on tall towers, others floating on platforms. By angling them with precise geometry, Atlanteans could bathe entire plazas in light even at night. Farmers supposedly grew crops year-round under redirected beams, and priests claimed to store sunlight in sacred chambers for later use. It was solar power, but with far less modesty and far more glowing smugness. Naturally, this technology was framed as spiritual. The mirrors weren't just about agriculture or city planning, they were said to channel divine radiance. Sunlight, to the Atlanteans, wasn't just photons, it was living fire, the breath of cosmic order. By controlling it, they weren't simply playing with nature, they were, in their own eyes, co-directors of the universe's lighting department. But as usual, things got messy. Redirecting the sun is a delicate business. A few degrees off, and your crops were scorched. A misaligned mirror could accidentally turn an ordinary afternoon into a death ray aimed at someone's garden party. Legends even tell of mirrors so powerful that they set entire hillsides on fire when no one was paying attention. To make matters worse, the mirrors needed constant calibration. Priests had to hum in harmony with the devices, nudging their alignment with chants that must have sounded less like enlightenment and more like desperate mic checks. The mirrors also reinforced hierarchy. The nobility kept their districts permanently illuminated, enjoying endless daylight, while commoners were left in the dark, literally. Some neighborhoods were forced into shadows so the elites could bask in perpetual sunshine. The balance between day and night, so natural everywhere else, was reshaped into a privilege. Atlantis, it seems, invented not only solar engineering but also solar inequality, and, when the flood came, the mirrors played their cruelest trick. As the waters rose, the once proud structures reflected sunlight wildly across the sinking city, dazzling eyes and blinding those who tried to flee. Witnesses claimed the final hours of Atlantis were lit like a blazing festival, water glinting in every direction, as if the city were determined to go down glowing. The mirrors, designed to control light, ended up scattering it into chaos. What makes the story strange isn't that the mirrors failed, it's that they succeeded too well. They gave Atlantis the power to summon day at will, but no way to handle the night that inevitably followed. They bent sunlight into obedience, yet were undone by something as simple as water. Perhaps the real irony of the sun mirrors is that they proved you can control the heavens for a while, but never the horizon. Weather has always been a nuisance. Too hot, too cold, too rainy, too dry. Someone is always complaining. Most societies deal with it by building houses, inventing clothing, or, at the very least, staying indoors. But Atlantis allegedly went one step further. According to legend, they invented weather rods, towering devices that controlled the climate at will. With a flick of a crystal staff, they could summon sunshine, disperse storms, or create breezes precisely calibrated to flutter noblemen's robes without ruining the pleats. The rods were said to be massive columns of metal and crystal, planted around the city like oversized tuning forks. When activated, they vibrated in resonance with the sky, sending signals that shifted clouds, winds, and rainfall. To the Atlanteans, weather wasn't an uncontrollable force. It was another variable to fine-tune, as if the sky itself were just a badly organized orchestra in need of a conductor. Naturally, this wasn't just technology. It was dressed up as spirituality. The rods weren't weather machines, they were celestial harmonizers. Rain wasn't water falling from clouds. It was a divine note plucked from the heavens. Sunshine wasn't radiation. It was a blessing they could schedule for Tuesday mornings. By blending engineering with mysticism, Atlanteans turned meteorology into theology, complete with priests serving as atmospheric custodians. But, as with everything else in Atlantis, control came at a cost. The rods required constant attention. Misuse could lead to droughts in one region, floods in another, and occasional lightning bolts that struck entirely the wrong targets. Myths even describe instances where a rod overloaded, creating storms so violent that even the domes of the city shook. Instead of harmony, the devices often caused chaos, proof that managing weather is more complicated than waving a staff and chanting about clouds. There was also the question of fairness. The elite districts received perfectly calibrated breezes and gentle rainfall for their gardens, while poorer areas endured whatever scraps of climate were left. If your neighborhood wilted in the sun, priests might say it was karmic balance, not poor weather management. In other words, climate inequality was baked into the system long before anyone thought to complain about emissions or carbon footprints. And when Atlantis began to sink, the rods went berserk. As the waters rose, frantic priests tried to stabilize the skies, summoning winds to push back the waves or rain to fill imaginary reservoirs. Instead, the rods sparked storms that hastened the city's destruction. Lightning illuminated drowning towers, gales tore through crumbling plazas, and rain poured down on citizens already surrounded by seawater. The devices designed to master the sky had only invited it to join the ocean in finishing the job. What lingers in the myth of the weather rods isn't their failure, but their ambition. The Atlanteans didn't just accept the climate, they rewrote it. They believed nature could be domesticated, bent into a schedule like a servant, and maybe that was their true downfall. Not the flood itself, but the belief that the world should bend to their comfort, because in the end, the weather always wins. Before there were hard drives, thumb drives, or cloud storage subscriptions you keep forgetting to cancel, there were allegedly Atlantean thought crystals. These weren't just shiny baubles for decoration. They were said to be living storage units, capable of capturing and holding entire streams of consciousness. Forget writing down your ideas. In Atlantis, you whispered to a crystal, and it remembered for you forever. The crystals were described as smooth, perfectly cut stones, each resonating with a faint hum. They could be programmed, if that's the right word, by focusing your thoughts while holding them. Once attuned, the crystal absorbed your idea, locking it into its geometric structure. Later, another person could pick up the same stone, touch it, and download the stored thought, as if it were their own. In a world where literacy wasn't universal, this was less a convenience and more a revolution. Why teach reading when you could just hand someone a rock with yesterday's lecture embedded inside it? Naturally, these devices weren't treated as technology. They were sacred. Priests claimed the crystals weren't merely memory banks, but fragments of divine order, vessels that held echoes of the universal mind. Each stored thought was a sacred vibration, each crystal a shard of cosmic truth. Of course, this didn't stop people from using them for mundane purposes, like remembering shopping lists or stashing half-baked poetry. Sacred or not, utility usually wins. The system, however, came with risks. Crystals weren't selective about what they stored. A stray, intrusive thought could end up immortalized, alongside your carefully composed wisdom. Imagine passing down a family heirloom crystal, only to discover that great-grandfather's deepest legacy was a mental loop about forgetting where he put his sandals. Worse, the crystals didn't always play back in the same order. A single stone might bombard you with decades of random mental snapshots, leaving you unsure whether you were enlightened or just overwhelmed. Still, the thought crystals gave Atlantis a strange kind of cultural immortality. Their society wasn't built on written archives or oral traditions, but on stones humming with memory. Libraries must have looked less like shelves of books and more like piles of glittering gemstones, each buzzing faintly with somebody's opinion about the proper frequency of breakfast chanting. But when the flood came, the crystals were scattered. Some sank with the city, tumbling into the ocean's depths, their stored thoughts flickering uselessly in the dark. Others may have been carried away by survivors, sparking legends in distant lands about magical stones that whispered when touched. Whether those whispers were Atlantean wisdom or just seawater eroding old vibrations is anyone's guess. The thought crystals didn't preserve Atlantis forever. They couldn't hold back the waves or rebuild the towers. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe they were less about permanence and more about vanity, the desire to be remembered, even if only as a faint hum in a stone. And if you think about it, that's not so different from us today, filling up hard drives and cloud servers, hoping our digital echoes outlast the tides of time. Every civilization has to deal with water. Too much of it, and you drown. Too little, and you starve. Most cultures solved this problem with aqueducts, wells, or buckets. Atlantis, predictably, claimed to have gone further. They supposedly built water gates, massive systems that controlled tides, rivers, and even rainfall, regulating the flow of nature itself as if the ocean were just another house pet in need of discipline. The water gates were described as towering structures of stone and crystal, equipped with channels that could redirect rivers, open reservoirs, and even influence the rising and falling of the sea. Priests maintained them, adjusting their alignment through chants that kept the flow harmonized. According to the legends, entire districts of Atlantis could be irrigated or drained at will, simply by opening the right gate. Farmers got fertile fields, nobles got ornamental fountains, and everyone else got the satisfaction of living in a city that claimed to boss around the ocean. Naturally, this wasn't just engineering, it was wrapped in spirituality. The gates weren't plumbing, they were veins of the earth, conduits through which the life force of the planet pulsed. Operating them was treated like a sacred ritual. Priests didn't just open sluices, they performed ceremonies, complete with chanting, incense, and the occasional theatrical splash of water for effect. Plumbing became liturgy, and water management was elevated into a cosmic balancing act. But the flaws were, as always, plentiful. The gates required constant maintenance. If one mechanism failed, entire neighborhoods could be flooded in minutes. If a priest chanted out of tune, irrigation canals overflowed and drowned crops. Legends even describe cases where competing priests tried to manipulate the gates for their own districts, sparking literal turf wars fought with redirected rivers. Atlantean spiritual plumbing wasn't so much divine order as a very wet bureaucracy. And yet, for a time, the water gates seemed to work. Atlantis prospered, its fields nourished, its fountains glittering, its image burnished as the civilization that had truly mastered the flow of nature. But mastery is a dangerous illusion. The same gates that made Atlantis flourish also became its weakness. When the Great Flood came, the mechanisms jammed, the channels burst, and the carefully controlled water roared back with vengeance. The city wasn't drowned despite its plumbing. It was drowned because of it. The irony is almost too perfect. A civilization that believed it could regulate the tides ended up consumed by them. The water gates, once symbols of control, became monuments to hubris, proof that the ocean doesn't negotiate. If they survived at all, they're now nothing more than ruins at the bottom of the sea, barnacles clinging to the remnants of what was once the most overconfident plumbing system in human imagination. Every society has its sacred flames. The Greeks had their hearths, the Persians their eternal fires, and even modern sports ceremonies insist on lighting torches to prove continuity. Atlantis, naturally, claimed to have perfected the concept. According to legend, they built fire altars powered not by ordinary wood, but by mysterious fuels that burned indefinitely. These flames were said to never waver, never smoke, and never go out until, of course, the ocean got involved. The altars were described as grand structures of stone and crystal, often situated in the heart of temples. The fire itself was said to glow with colors not found in ordinary flames: blue, violet, even shimmering silver. Some claimed it wasn't fire at all, but condensed energy from the Earth's core, funneled upward through channels that only Atlantean engineers understood. Standing before such a blaze was supposed to cleanse the spirit, balance the soul, and make you feel very smug about belonging to a society that literally improved on fire. But as always, the flames weren't just practical, they were deeply spiritual. The altars symbolized continuity, the promise that Atlantean civilization would shine forever. Priests guarded the fires obsessively, chanting to keep them steady, and warning that any flicker was a bad omen. Weddings, initiations, even political ceremonies, all revolved around these flames. To extinguish one wasn't just clumsy, it was sacrilege, the kind of faux pas that could earn you a lifetime of pointed humming from angry temple officials. Still, problems crept in. Eternal flames require eternal fuel, and no matter how mystical the source, someone had to tend the system. Stories hint that when supplies of rare crystals or minerals ran low, altars sputtered embarrassingly, forcing priests to invent excuses about spiritual fluctuations. Rivalries also arose, with temples competing over whose fire shone brightest, as if cosmic truth could be measured in lumens. Even eternal flames, it seemed, could be reduced to status symbols. And then, of course, came the flood. The fires that had burned for centuries hissed and vanished in seconds as water poured over them. The altars cracked, their sacred channels clogged with seawater and debris. The same priests who once bragged about eternal light were left clutching soggy torches, watching their civilization drown in darkness. For a city that believed itself immortal, Nothing was more humiliating than the sound of its sacred flames sizzling out like candles in a storm. Yet, perhaps that's why the myth endures. Eternal fires are less about permanence than they are about hope, the stubborn insistence that something can last forever. Atlantis learned the hard way that no flame, no matter how mystical, survives a tide. But the idea that it could, that's the spark that lingers. In the end, their eternal flames didn't illuminate their temples, they illuminated their arrogance. Most ancient civilizations were content with modest buildings, mud bricks, wooden beams, maybe a few grand palaces if the budget allowed. Atlantis, naturally, wasn't interested in modesty. According to legend, they constructed towering structures of glass and crystal that pierced the skies long before steel beams or modern cranes existed. These glass towers weren't just buildings, they were spiritual symbols dressed up as architecture, proof that Atlanteans preferred to live not only above the rest of the world, but also above common sense. The towers were described as translucent monoliths, shimmering with rainbow light as the sun struck them at different angles. Their walls supposedly resonated with vibrations, creating tones that could be heard when the wind passed through them. Inside, the air was cool and luminous, as if the building itself filtered sunlight into something holy. Priests claimed the towers aligned with star maps, making each structure a physical hymn to the heavens. In other words, they were less office space and more cosmic karaoke machines. Functionally, the towers served multiple roles. Some were temples, where rituals echoed through the glass walls, like divine amplifiers. Others were said to be research centers, storing crystals, thought devices, and whatever counted as Atlantean paperwork. And of course, the tallest towers were occupied by the elite, who enjoyed panoramic views of the city, while commoners squinted up at their glowing fortresses. Nothing establishes social hierarchy quite like living in a structure that doubles as a lighthouse of smugness. But the towers weren't flawless. For one, glass is fragile, even when allegedly infused with cosmic resonance. Strong winds could cause unnerving vibrations, and earthquakes, whether literal or symbolic, left cracks that priests had to explain away with creative metaphors. Some myths even describe towers collapsing dramatically, their shattered fragments scattering like divine confetti across the streets below. Apparently, enlightenment didn't come with safety regulations. There were also complaints from ordinary citizens. The reflective surfaces often blinded passers-by, turning midday walks into accidental staring contests with the sun. At night, the towers glowed faintly, keeping neighbors awake with what was essentially the world's first case of light pollution. Atlanteans might have called it a spiritual beacon, but to the average resident, it was just a giant cosmic nightlight that refused to switch off. And then, inevitably, the flood arrived. The towers, so proud and gleaming, became liabilities. Glass cracked under the pressure of rushing water, shattering into shards that glittered briefly before sinking into darkness. The same sunlight-catching walls that once dazzled the world reflected only chaos as the city went under. Legends claim that for a few moments, Atlantis looked like a chandelier being extinguished, light scattering wildly before vanishing into the deep. What survives of the story isn't the towers themselves, they're gone, whether shattered or buried beneath sand, but the idea behind them. The Atlanteans wanted to touch the sky with crystal and glass, to prove their civilization could rise higher and shine brighter than anyone else. And they did, briefly. The tragedy wasn't that the towers fell, it's that they stood long enough for everyone to believe they never would. Seafaring cultures everywhere built lighthouses, simple towers with flames to guide ships through treacherous waters. Atlantis, being allergic to simplicity, allegedly built orb beacons, floating spheres of light that didn't just mark the coast but were said to guide the soul itself. These glowing orbs hovered above the sea, pulsating like celestial buoys, making navigation feel less like following a map and more like attending a cosmic rave. The orbs were described as massive crystal globes, filled with captured fire, suspended in mid-air by forces no one bothered to explain. From the shore, they appeared as giant stars resting just above the waves, humming faintly in unison. Sailors claimed they could orient themselves simply by following the resonance of the orbs, as though the ocean had been fitted with divine GPS. Of course, the system wasn't foolproof. If two orbs drifted too close together, sailors often sailed confidently in circles, guided faithfully into nowhere. As usual, spirituality framed the whole enterprise. The orb beacons weren't just practical navigation tools, they were symbols of enlightenment. Each glow represented a fragment of cosmic wisdom, a reminder that no soul was truly lost at sea, because Atlantis had installed floating nightlights for humanity. Priests told stories of the orbs doubling as guardians, warding off evil spirits and calming storms. Whether that actually worked is unclear, though it probably looked impressive while failing. But problems persisted. Orbs required constant recharging at temples, which meant someone had to haul them back and forth between the ocean and sacred chambers. There were also disputes over ownership. Fishermen wanted orbs stationed near their routes, while merchants demanded brighter ones along trade passages. The elites, predictably, wanted orbs floating by their private beaches, just to make sure their moonlit swims looked sufficiently mystical. Managing the orb network was less divine order and more petty coastal politics. And then, when the flood arrived, the orbs betrayed them. Instead of guiding ships to safety, they bobbed uselessly as the rising waters swallowed the city. Survivors reported the beacons scattering across the sea, glowing faintly like lost lanterns drifting farther and farther away. The lighthouses for the soul had no plan for mass drowning. They simply floated, indifferent, until their light dimmed into nothing. The irony is that the orb beacons outlasted everything else, at least for a while. Where towers collapsed and temples sank, the orbs rolled across the waves, glimmering as if Atlantis still existed just beyond the horizon. Maybe some washed ashore in foreign lands, becoming sacred relics with no instructions included. Maybe some still drift, glowing faintly in the abyss. Confusing deep-sea fish, with reminders of a civilization that couldn't save itself. Most cultures measured time with shadows, sand, or gears. Atlantis, of course, thought clocks should double as swimming pools. According to legend, they built time pools, vast basins of shimmering liquid, said to reflect not just the present but also the past and future. Instead of glancing at a sundial, Atlanteans allegedly dove into a pool and emerged knowing exactly how late they were. The pools were described as circular basins lined with reflective crystals, filled with water infused with rare minerals. At rest, the surface looked like liquid glass, rippling faintly with cosmic rhythm. By gazing into it, you could allegedly see the current hour reflected in patterns of light. By entering the pool, however, things became more complicated. The myth's claim initiates swam through currents that represented minutes and hours, with stronger swimmers moving faster through time. Whether this was visionary experience or just dizziness from holding your breath too long, no one could say. Priests framed the pools as sacred. Time wasn't mechanical. They insisted it was alive, fluid, and cyclical, just like the pools themselves. To them, swimming through time was the highest form of meditation, a merging of body and eternity. For ordinary citizens, though, the pools probably served more practical purposes. Scheduling harvests, timing ceremonies, or finding out how long you'd been standing in line for bread. Nothing says advanced civilization like cannonballing into a clock. Naturally, the system wasn't perfect. Not everyone interpreted the reflections the same way. One priest might see dawn in the ripples, while another insisted it was midnight. This occasionally led to entire festivals being held 12 hours off schedule, leaving half the city drunk, while the other half was still preparing decorations. Worse, swimming through the pools sometimes induced visions people weren't prepared for, glimpses of potential futures that could be inspiring or horrifying, depending on how much you trusted Atlantean water quality. Yet for all its flaws, the time pools symbolized Atlantis perfectly. They represented mastery, arrogance, and the belief that natural forces could be transformed into leisure activities. To swim in time was to assert that even hours and minutes were subjects of Atlantean will. For a society obsessed with control, it was less about telling time and more about owning it. When the flood came, however, the pools dissolved into irony. Water poured over the city, blurring the boundaries of time until minutes and centuries were equally meaningless. Survivors said the pools boiled with reflections, showing 1,000 fractured timelines before vanishing into the ocean. If they truly revealed past, present, and future, then perhaps the last thing they showed was the simple truth that all clocks eventually run out. And maybe that's the quiet lesson buried in the myth. Atlantis didn't lose time, it drowned in it. The pools promised endless cycles, but cycles always close, even for civilizations that believe otherwise. In the end, the Atlanteans swam through their hours until there were none left, and the tide kept the final count. Night has always been inconvenient. It's dark, it's cold, and it limits how much you can admire your own architectural achievements. Most civilizations settled for torches, oil lamps, or maybe a good campfire. Atlantis, predictably, wasn't satisfied. According to legend, they created moon discs, polished, glowing artifacts designed to capture lunar light and release it on demand. In short, they invented portable nightlight philosophy, because apparently the actual moon just wasn't doing enough. The discs were described as flat, perfectly circular pieces of crystal or metal, each infused with subtle luminescence. By day, they absorbed solar and lunar energy. By night, they glowed with a silvery sheen, casting light strong enough to illuminate entire courtyards. Priests carried them during ceremonies, nobles displayed them at banquets, and travelers used them to navigate dark paths. To hold a moon disk was to hold a fragment of the cosmos in your hand, or at least, that was the sales pitch. Naturally, the technology was wrapped in spiritual significance. The discs weren't lanterns, they were mirrors of the eternal night. Priests insisted they embodied balance, half light, half dark, a portable yin-yang disguised as glowing dinnerware. Entire rituals revolved around arranging discs in patterns that supposedly aligned with lunar cycles. Whether this achieved cosmic harmony or just looked like a giant board game, no one really clarified. Practical use, however, was not without its complications. Some discs glowed too brightly, disrupting sleep for anyone unlucky enough to live near them. Others flickered unpredictably, causing confusion during ceremonies and making entire processions look like poorly timed strobe parties. There were even disputes over ownership after all. If you claim to hold the moon, you're bound to attract both envy and lawsuits. Still, the discs became deeply ingrained in Atlantean life. Markets stayed open at night, lovers met under artificial moonlight, and festivals spilled into endless evenings lit by portable fragments of glow. For a while, it must have felt like the Atlanteans had conquered darkness itself, bending night into their schedule the way they bent everything else. But when the flood came, the discs lost their stage. Submerged in seawater, their glow dimmed, then vanished. Those that floated away became eerie willow, the wisps on the drowning horizon, guiding no one and illuminating nothing but the futility of their invention. A moon in your pocket can't hold back the tide, and yet the story of the moon discs lingers. Maybe it's because they embodied the Atlantean dream so well. Light without fire, control without limit, eternity in miniature. Or maybe it's because humanity has always been tempted by the idea of carrying the heavens with us, of holding a little slice of sky to ward off the dark. Atlantis sank, but the idea didn't. We still chase glowing screens, night lights, and handheld moons of our own making. The discs didn't outlive the flood, but their desire did. Every civilization has its thrones. They're usually big, uncomfortable chairs, designed more for symbolism than for actual sitting. Atlantis, however, allegedly created dream thrones, seats that weren't just for ruling but for rewriting reality itself. According to legend, anyone who sat in one could project visions into the world, shaping events through sheer thought, provided they had enough stamina to sit upright for long stretches of time. The thrones were described as carved from a single block of luminous stone, inlaid with metals that shimmered faintly in the dark. Their backs rose high like cathedral arches, etched with patterns that supposedly resonated with the mind. Sitting in one wasn't a casual act, it was a ritual. The occupant was said to close their eyes, enter a trance, and project their will outward until the world rearranged itself accordingly. A ruler didn't just command armies, they allegedly commanded reality itself, all while maintaining good posture. Naturally, this wasn't framed as technology. Priests claimed the thrones were conduits of cosmic law, tuned to the vibrations of the universe. They weren't chairs, they were instruments. The body was merely the musician, the mind, the melody, and the throne, the amplifier. To sit upon one was to merge your identity with Atlantis itself, which conveniently also reinforced the idea that power belonged only to those wealthy enough to afford designer furniture with magical side effects. Of course, things weren't quite so neat in practice. Competing rulers sometimes projected conflicting visions, leaving reality wobbling like a badly tuned harp. Citizens reported sudden changes in weather, architecture, or even street layouts, depending on whose dream throne was working harder that day. Legends describe days when entire neighborhoods shifted overnight, confusing residents who woke up to find their homes had mysteriously rotated 90 degrees. Evidently, reality editing furniture had quality control issues. And then there was the psychological toll. Sitting on a dream throne too long supposedly blurred the line between imagination and truth. Some rulers lost themselves entirely, convinced their fantasies were real, even as the city around them crumbled. Others grew addicted, unwilling to leave their seats, spending days projecting minor whims, sunsets that lasted too long, rainbows that wouldn't fade, or endless feasts no one could actually eat. It was power as self-indulgence, disguised as spirituality. When the flood came, the thrones proved useless. No matter how powerful the visions, no ruler could dream the water away. Thrones toppled, stones cracked, and the chairs that once pretended to command reality ended up as oversized furniture, tumbling through the deep. Their promise of control dissolved into bubbles. Their power extinguished the moment the sea decided to sit down, uninvited. But the image of the dream thrones lingers, not because they worked, but because they embodied the Atlantean delusion so perfectly. The idea that reality itself could be edited like a draft, polished until it obeyed. And perhaps that's the most enduring myth, that somewhere, hidden in the ruins, a chair still waits, humming faintly, promising to grant anyone foolish enough to sit on it the same illusion that the world will bend for them, if only they imagine hard enough. Every civilization struggles with memory. Too much of it becomes a burden. Too little leaves you repeating the same mistakes. Most cultures handled this with storytelling, books, or alcohol. Atlantis, predictably, went for something stranger: memory fountains. According to legend, these ornate structures didn't just provide drinking water, they allowed you to selectively forget whatever you wished. Forgetfulness wasn't a flaw in Atlantis. It was a luxury feature. The fountains were described as tall basins carved from marble and crystal, their water shimmering faintly with a silvery glow. To drink from one was said to wash away particular memories, an argument, a failure, an embarrassing song you sang too loudly at a banquet. Priests claimed the fountains were aligned with the flow of cosmic cycles, pulling unwanted recollections out of the mind like weeds from a garden. Supposedly, the water didn't erase knowledge necessary for survival, only the memories people were spiritually ready to release. Which sounds noble, but also suspiciously convenient for rulers with things to hide. Naturally, the fountains became heavily spiritualized. Forgetting was called purification. Memory was framed as a burden, something to be set down like an old cloak. Ceremonies were held in which entire groups of citizens drank together, conveniently forgetting debts, disputes, or poorly handled public speeches. Atlantis turned selective amnesia into a communal ritual, complete with chanting, incense, and the reassurance that losing half your past was proof of enlightenment. But flaws abounded. Some drank too much, wiping out whole years of experience in an afternoon. Others claimed the fountains played tricks, erasing things you wanted to keep while leaving the embarrassments intact. Families occasionally quarreled when one member purified themselves of every obligation, then insisted they had no memory of the promises everyone else swore were made. In short, Atlantean spirituality turned into a bureaucratic nightmare whenever memory was optional, and yet the idea spread. For a while, Atlantis enjoyed what must have been an enviable social life: arguments forgotten, grudges erased, embarrassments dissolved like sugar in water. But there was a price. A society too willing to forget eventually forgets what holds it together. Warnings faded, lessons vanished. The same mistakes repeated endlessly, scrubbed clean by a sip of silvery water. The fountains didn't build wisdom, they prevented it. When the flood came, the fountains bubbled and broke, mixing their waters with the rising sea. Whatever memories they contained, whether personal or collective, spilled into the ocean. The Atlanteans, who once erased their pasts, now had it erased for them, permanently, with no choice in the matter. A culture obsessed with forgetting was finally forgotten in full, and maybe that's the strangest twist of all. The memory fountains worked too well. Atlantis didn't need the world's help to vanish from history. It drank itself into oblivion, one cup at a time. Every civilization has music. Some bang drums, others blow horns, and a few invent complicated instruments, just to prove they can. Atlantis, according to legend, didn't just play music, they built it. Their so-called sound temples were structures designed to resonate with cosmic frequencies, creating vibrations that were supposed to heal the body, elevate the soul, and occasionally crack the glass towers down the street if the pitch ran too high. The temples were described as vast halls of polished stone, designed so that a single chant could echo 100-fold. Crystals embedded in the walls amplified the sound, making even the faintest hum roll through the chamber like thunder. Priests claimed these vibrations weren't ordinary acoustics, they were harmonics of the universe itself, each note aligning the human spirit with the secret rhythms of creation. In simpler terms, sit in a temple, chant loudly, and hope reality tuned itself into something nicer. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Some citizens swore the temples gave them headaches instead of enlightenment. Farmers complained that the endless droning sessions interfered with sleep. Visitors whispered that the whole thing felt less like cosmic alignment and more like being trapped in a room with particularly smug monks experimenting with surround sound. Yet the temples thrived, in part because they provided an easy way for rulers to disguise politics as spirituality. A decree delivered through a chorus of priests humming in perfect harmony sounded less like law and more like destiny. The temples were also competitive. Each district tried to outdo the others, building larger chambers, adding more crystals, or inventing new sacred scales that allegedly healed specific ailments. Headaches, broken hearts, poor harvests, all were blamed on being out of tune. Entire industries formed around diagnosing people's vibrational imbalances, followed, of course, by costly ritual treatments. Sound wasn't just sacred, it was monetized. And then, inevitably, came the flood. As waters rose, the temples filled, turning their perfect acoustics into drowning chambers. Instead of harmonics, they produced garbled gurgles and muffled echoes as the sea claimed them. The sacred vibrations were silenced, replaced by the blunt rhythm of waves pounding against stone. No chant, no matter how finely tuned, could hold back the tide. The temples that promised to synchronize humanity with the cosmos ended their careers sounding like giant bathtubs. Still, the idea of sound temples lingers in myth, maybe because it appeals to something universal, the belief that music or noise carefully disguised as music can change the world. Atlantis drowned, but the fascination with vibration didn't. From chanting monks to wellness playlists claiming to heal your DNA, the spirit of those temples lives on. The Atlanteans thought they were conducting the universe. In reality, they were just humming along, waiting for the song to end. Every civilization has markets. Some sell food, others textiles, and most eventually dabble in overpriced trinkets nobody really needs. Atlantis, however, allegedly had something more exotic: shadow markets. These weren't physical stalls, but hidden spaces said to exist half in the real world and half in some overlapping dimension. Instead of buying grain or pottery, Atlanteans claimed you could purchase knowledge, dreams, or even entire fragments of fate. In short, it was commerce with a spiritual aftertaste, and all the shady accounting that came with it. The shadow markets were described as vast plazas shrouded in perpetual twilight, lit not by torches but by faint glimmers of energy radiating from the stalls themselves. Merchants sold intangible goods, a lost memory bottled like perfume, a whispered prophecy stored in crystal, or the sensation of courage to borrow for an afternoon. Currency wasn't gold or silver, but resonance, a unit of personal vitality. To buy something, you handed over a fragment of your own essence, which sounds poetic until you realize it was basically the spiritual version of paying with your liver. Naturally, the markets were draped in ritual. Transactions weren't just economic, they were framed as acts of cosmic balance. Giving up part of yourself to gain something new was treated like a sacred exchange, proof that commerce itself was divine. Priests claimed the markets reflected the balance of light and dark, truth and illusion. Cynics might argue they reflected little more than opportunism disguised as enlightenment, but cynics rarely got invited to browse. Of course, the flaws were obvious. Merchants sometimes sold faulty dreams that dissolved on contact, or prophecies that contradicted each other within the same sentence. Buyers who overspent their resonance often walked away feeling hollow, confused, or spiritually bankrupt. Shadow markets also attracted their share of con artists. Anyone with a crystal and a good stage whisper could pose as a vendor. It turns out that when the merchandise is invisible, quality control is difficult. And yet, the markets thrived. Citizens returned again and again, addicted not just to the goods but to the idea that anything could be purchased if one was willing to risk a piece of themselves. For a civilization obsessed with control, the promise of buying courage, love, or foresight was irresistible. Atlantis didn't just build temples of commerce, they sanctified the very act of bargaining with the unknown. When the flood came, the shadow markets collapsed with everything else. The plazas dissolved into waterlogged ruins, and whatever existed in their half-world dimension slipped away. Maybe the merchants packed up their intangible goods and moved on. Or maybe the markets drowned, too, proving that even twilight can't outlast the tide. And yet, the idea of the shadow market persists, not because people believe in Atlantean bazaars hidden between dimensions, but because the metaphor is too sharp to ignore. Every civilization has places where secrets are sold, bargains are made, and costs are paid in something more precious than coin. Atlantis just happened to mythologize theirs. We call them legends. Everyone else just calls them backrooms. Every civilization invents ways to get the dead where they're supposed to go. Egyptians had their solar barks, Vikings had their burning ships, and most cultures at least imagined some sort of ferry to the afterlife. Atlantis, naturally, had to go bigger. According to legend, they built soul vessels, boats, designed not to cross seas, but to carry spirits directly into the next world. Think less cargo transport, more afterlife commute. The vessels were described as sleek and luminous, crafted from rare woods inlaid with shimmering crystal. They supposedly glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and moved without oars or sails. Instead of drifting on water, they floated just above it, gliding silently across rivers, lakes, or even through the air itself. Priests claimed these vessels could only be boarded by the spirit, never the flesh. To step into one while alive was to be denied, like trying to catch a bus that refused to acknowledge your existence. As usual, the vessels weren't merely technology, they were saturated with symbolism. They represented transition, the gentle passage from one state of being to another. Priests insisted the boats were guided not by wind but by cosmic harmony, carrying passengers to whatever plane they had earned in life. Ceremonies often featured the launching of symbolic vessels, miniature models sent afloat on canals, while chants echoed across the city. It was spectacle as much as faith, a ritualized assurance that nobody had to walk to eternity. But like everything Atlantean, the system had problems. For one, not all spirits were eager to depart. Legends mention vessels hovering stubbornly in place, as if refusing to carry souls burdened with too much regret or too many unpaid debts. Other times, multiple boats appeared for the same person, leaving bewildered priests to argue over which direction the soul had actually gone. Nothing undermines faith quite like your holy ferry service operating with double bookings. And yet, the vessels became central to Atlantean identity. Families boasted of visions in which ancestors sailed away smoothly, while rival households whispered that their enemies' spirits had been left stranded, unable to board. The myth of the soul vessel turned the afterlife into a status symbol, another way for Atlantis to turn spirituality into an elaborate competition. When the flood arrived, however, the myth unraveled. Water rushed through the streets, carrying everything alive and dead, whether they had booked a vessel or not. The priests could chant, the families could pray, but the flood was the only boatman that mattered. The irony was complete. The city that promised a graceful passage for souls found itself crammed into one massive, unasked, for departure. And perhaps that's why the image of the soul vessels endures. They weren't just boats for the dead, they were Atlantean hope, made visible. The idea that someone, somewhere, had arranged a smooth journey into the unknown. Whether they worked or not, that's the dream. Atlantis didn't sink because it built soul vessels. It sank because it believed the tide would honor the ticket. Imagine walking into a doctor's office where there are no herbs, no scalpels, and no medicines, just a room that hums loudly while someone insists you're being cured. That, according to legend, was the healing chamber of Atlantis. The Atlanteans believed that sickness wasn't about germs or injuries, but about being out of tune with the universe. Their solution wasn't surgery or salves, but sitting you in a crystal-lined chamber and letting sound vibrations allegedly repair your body. It was healthcare as karaoke, with fewer instruments and more chanting. The chambers were described as dome-shaped rooms, their walls studded with polished stones that pulsed faintly with light. When activated, the entire space would vibrate, filling the air with deep, resonant tones. Patients lay in the center, soaking in the hum, while priests circled the chamber, chanting in carefully arranged harmonies. The idea was simple. The body was an instrument, disease was dissonance, and all you needed to heal was a cosmic tuning fork. Spirituality wrapped the practice in lofty explanations. Illness was spiritual imbalance. Pain was blocked energy. Even something as mundane as a stubbed toe could be recast as a failure to align with cosmic rhythm. Priests assured patients that the chamber didn't just heal the body, it elevated the spirit, which was very convenient, because explaining why the pain never actually went away was much easier if you insisted it was part of a mystical process. Naturally, results varied. Some patients swore they left feeling lighter, healthier, even euphoric. Others reported dizziness, nausea, or worse ailments after enduring hours of relentless humming. Critics argued the chambers treated boredom more effectively than disease, since at least you fell asleep while waiting to feel better. And of course, there were the inevitable frauds, fake priests setting up makeshift chambers with shiny rocks and improvised chanting, promising miracle cures for the right price. Still, the healing chambers became central to Atlantean identity. They reflected the civilization's obsession with turning spirituality into engineering, and engineering into spirituality. Why stitch a wound when you could chant at it? Why mix herbs when you could vibrate loudly in a crystal cave? It wasn't medicine as we'd recognize it, it was theatrical wellness, a blend of hope, faith, and acoustics. But when the flood came, the chambers had nothing to offer. The hum of crystals was drowned out by the roar of collapsing temples. Vibrations meant nothing against the weight of the sea. Those who once trusted in harmonics to keep them alive discovered, too late, that water doesn't respect chants or tuning forks. The chambers fell silent, their promise of eternal health extinguished in an instant. And maybe that's why the legend stings. The healing chambers weren't useless because they failed. They were useless because they convinced people to believe failure was progress. In the end, Atlantis didn't die of disease. It died of misplaced faith in a cure that only ever hummed back at them. According to the stories, Atlanteans didn't just chart seas and stars, they charted dreams. These so-called dream maps were diagrams of the subconscious, detailed scrolls, said to track the terrain of the sleeping mind. A cartographer in Atlantis wasn't just a map maker. They were a guide to nightmares, a tour operator for the landscapes you wandered while unconscious. The maps were drawn on sheets of treated skin or crystal panels, covered with symbols that looked nothing like coastlines or rivers. Instead, they marked things like the forest of fears, the ocean of longing, or the spiral of forgotten faces. Priests claimed the maps could help dreamers navigate their sleep more deliberately, transforming nightmares into opportunities for wisdom. It was lucid dreaming, rebranded as cosmic geography. Owning a dream map quickly became fashionable. Nobles consulted them before bed, treating sleep like an expedition requiring provisions and a tour guide. Entire schools of dream reading developed, each with their own theories on which symbols meant what. Some insisted the spiral was rebirth. Others swore it was indigestion. If you woke up confused, there was always a priest ready to sell you an annotated version for a modest fee. Naturally, problems arose. Maps contradicted each other constantly, with one priest insisting your nightmare of falling meant prosperity, while another claimed it was an omen of doom. Some dreamers obsessed over their maps so much they stopped living in the waking world, convinced that real life was just preparation for their nightly voyages. Worse still, a few people tried to follow their dream maps literally, wandering into forests or mountains in search of landmarks that only existed in their sleep. Still, the idea of charting the unchartable appealed to Atlantean pride. To them, mapping the unconscious was just another way of proving nothing was beyond their grasp. Dreams weren't mysteries, they were neighborhoods. And Atlantis planned to own the property rights. Then came the flood, and the dream maps were washed away along with everything else. The symbols blurred, the parchment dissolved, the panels cracked. Whatever knowledge or nonsense they contained, it was gone. The Atlanteans had tried to organize their fears into neat diagrams, only to discover that water doesn't respect maps, whether of the sea or the soul. And yet, the myth of the dream maps lingers, not because the charts survived, but because the ambition behind them still feels familiar. We still try to diagram what can't be diagrammed, to explain the inexplicable. The Atlanteans just did it with prettier ink. Maybe their maps didn't save them, but they remind us that sometimes a nightmare can't be navigated. It just has to be endured. Atlanteans never left fire alone. To them, a torch or a hearth was too ordinary, too fragile, too human. According to legend, they encased flames inside crystal globes, creating what were called fire orbs, bubbles of eternal fire that burned without smoke, without fuel, and without explanation. It wasn't enough to master the elements. They had to package them like decorative furniture. The orbs were said to be small enough to carry, glowing with a warm orange light that never dimmed. Priests displayed them in temples, nobles kept them on tables, and guards carried them during night patrols. Unlike ordinary flames, the fire orbs couldn't be extinguished by wind or water. They burned steadily, sealed in their transparent prisons, radiating both heat and a sense of smug superiority. Spirituality quickly layered itself onto the invention. The orbs weren't called tools, they were eternal flames of insight. Lighting a ceremony with one supposedly blessed the event with purity, longevity, and the illusion that Atlantis had bottled immortality. Ordinary fire cooked food. Atlantean fire illuminated the soul, or at least made dinner look more dramatic. Practical issues inevitably arose. The orbs were difficult to produce, requiring rare crystals and complex rituals that not even the artisans fully understood. Some flickered unexpectedly, others overheated, and more than one banquet ended abruptly when an orb cracked, spilling raw flame across the floor. Eternal fire, it turned out, was eternal until it wasn't. Still, the orbs became symbols of status. To own one was proof of wealth and cosmic favor, a way of declaring that your household contained something both divine and decorative. They were passed down as heirlooms, gifted as diplomatic tokens, and occasionally stolen, sparking feuds over who had rightful claim to a flame nobody could extinguish. When the flood arrived, the orbs bobbed uselessly on the water. Some floated away, glowing faintly beneath the waves. Others sank, their light bending strangely as the sea swallowed them whole. A few survivors swore they saw fire, glowing under the ocean long after the city was gone, little suns drifting through the darkness. And that's where the story ends, oddly, without clarity. Did the fire orbs finally gutter out in the deep, or do they still burn somewhere below, forgotten lanterns glowing in silence, waiting for someone foolish enough to find them? Atlantis itself is gone, but if you believe the stories, there might still be sparks of it alive, flickering where no one can reach. Some civilizations built monuments to gods, others built towers to watch the stars. Atlantis naturally aimed higher. Their sky towers were said to pierce the clouds, colossal spires that reached upward as if the Atlanteans believed heaven was a neighbor you could visit if you just climbed enough stairs. They weren't mere observation platforms. They were statements, stone and crystal ladders meant to prove humanity didn't belong on the ground. The towers were described as impossibly tall, their foundations wider than temples, their walls laced with shimmering veins of metal that glowed at night. Priests claimed they weren't built so much as grown, coaxed out of the earth by chants and resonant vibrations. To ascend, one wasn't just a physical climb, it was a ritual ascent of the soul, each level representing a step away from the mundane world. By the time you reached the top, you were supposedly close enough to brush eternity with your fingertips. Rituals swirled around the towers. Weddings, coronations, and initiations often ended with long processions winding upward, step after endless step, until the participants were gasping for breath in the thin air. From the summit, it was said, one could glimpse visions of other worlds, or hear whispers from the divine. Skeptics suggested the visions were just altitude sickness. But Atlantis had little interest in skeptics. Of course, the towers had their share of problems. Strong winds made the upper platforms dangerous, and more than one ceremony ended abruptly when someone misstepped. Maintaining the structures required vast labor, since crystal spires don't exactly weather storms gracefully. And as always, politics seeped in. Rival groups argued about which tower was holiest, which one actually touched the sky, and which ruler's tower was taller. The heavens, it seemed, were just another competition. Then came the flood. Water doesn't care about height. The towers, once so confident in their reach, became monuments of futility, their bases swallowed, their spires toppling one by one. Survivors claimed the tallest tower was the last thing to disappear beneath the waves, its tip glowing faintly as if protesting its own drowning. Atlantis had tried to climb above the world, and the world reminded them that no tower is taller than the tide. And so the sky towers linger only in myth. They're not remembered because they worked, but because of what they symbolized. A civilization convinced it could climb its way into eternity. The towers promised height, vision, and closeness to the divine. Instead, they delivered a final view of the horizon before it vanished forever. Maybe that's the truest ending Atlantis ever gave us. Not wisdom, not warning, just the image of a hand stretched upward, reaching for a sky that never reached back. And that's it, the strange, shimmering, and sometimes ridiculous world of Atlantean spirituality, where chairs edited reality, orbs trapped fire, and towers tried to climb into the sky. Atlantis didn't survive, but its stories somehow did, still floating around like half-forgotten dreams. If you enjoyed wandering through these myths in slow motion, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next strange bedtime exploration. And maybe here's the real reflection. Atlantis fascinates us not because it sank, but because it tried to rise too high. Every invention was a grasp at eternity, a refusal to accept limits. In the end, all of it went under. But the stories remain half warning, half lullaby. Now, close your eyes, let the noise of the day fade, and let the myths sink back into the deep where they came from. Atlantis is gone, but sleep, at least, is still here.